Andre Banks was 40 years old, and for 9 years he had worn the face of a man with nothing worth taking. He drove a work van with his company logo half peeled off the door. He bought his shirts 3 to a pack and ate his lunch standing up at job sites. His wife's family called him the help, behind his back and sometimes to his face. And Renata never once told them to stop. She'd laugh along, soft and apologetic, like she was embarrassed she'd married down. He sat across a polished conference table on a Monday in April and watched her lawyer smirk at him over a stack of papers. A young man in a watch worth more than the van, who slid a settlement across the table like he was doing Andre a favor. The man actually winked at Renata when he thought Andre wasn't looking. He spoke slowly, the way you talk to someone who won't follow, and laid out how much of the marital estate Andre would be walking away with. Almost nothing. A used vehicle and his tools. $240,000 had been moved out of accounts Renata thought he didn't track, funneled into a private account she'd opened 10 months before she ever said the word divorce. What that smirking lawyer never thought to do, not once before this meeting, was read past the summary page of the documents Andre's own attorney had quietly filed 2 weeks earlier. What happened next would wipe the smile off his face, one page at a time, and the page that did it was page 7. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you were watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The early light came in gray and soft through the windows of a kitchen Andre had gutted and rebuilt with his own hands, and he stood at the counter pressing grounds into the old steel percolator his grandmother had left him. The house was quiet, the good kind of quiet, before the phone started and the day began making its demands. He had set the butcher block counter himself, planing each board until it sat flush, and he ran his palm across the seam, now out of habit, feeling for a gap that was never there. His grandmother had raised him after his mother couldn't, in a narrow house on the south side, and she used to tell him while she kneaded dough, "Let folks count you cheap, baby. The ones counting your worth out loud are always the ones planning to spend it." She'd been gone 6 years. He still heard her in the rooms where he was alone. Renata came down already dressed, already on her phone, and she pressed a kiss to the air beside his cheek without quite landing it. There was a bracelet on her wrist he hadn't seen before, thin and bright and expensive, and she turned her arm so it caught the light when she thought he was watching, and turned it away when she caught him looking. She mentioned a girls' weekend coming up, the third that quarter, and slipped out the door before he could answer. He didn't ask. He built his whole life on the principle that you learn more by holding still. He remembered the first night they met 9 years back at a community college where he'd been teaching a night class on contracting and estimating of all things. She'd been auditing it to understand her uncle's construction business, and she'd asked the sharpest questions in the room. He'd liked her mind before he liked anything else. She had been generous then, or had performed generosity well enough that he couldn't tell the difference, and he had not yet understood that some people study you the way she'd studied that class, looking for the load-bearing parts so they'd know exactly where to cut. The slim phone in his jacket pocket buzzed once. Only 2 people had that number, and one of them was his accountant. He read the message and set his coffee down slow. It was from Marcus, who managed the bidding side of the firm, and it read, "Renata's uncle just put in to subcontract on the Davenport job under a shell company, pretending he doesn't know it's us. You seeing this?" Andre saw it. He saw all of it. Because the thing Renata's family had never bothered to learn, across 9 years of calling him the help, was that the company they all assumed he worked for was the company he owned. He'd started it at 26 with a single truck and a line of credit, and he'd grown it into a commercial outfit that pulled 8 figures a year in contracts. Held in a holding company named after his grandmother, with his name buried 3 layers deep, where no one curious about a man's worth would ever think to dig. Renata's own uncle had been bidding for years to get on Andre's projects, never once realizing whose table he was begging at. That night, Renata's private phone, the one she kept zipped in the inner pocket of her purse, lit up on the entry table while she was upstairs. Andre didn't touch it. He just read the preview that glowed there from a contact saved as D, and it said, "Soon as the settlement clears, we split it and I file the rest of the claims. He'll never know what hit him. Stay patient." His hands didn't shake. He photographed the screen, the time, the name, and set the phone back exactly as it lay. Then he poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, the way he'd done 1,000 nights. So they thought there was a fortune to split. They had it half right, and half right was the most dangerous way to be wrong, because they believed the company was a marital asset they could carve open in a courtroom. They didn't know it had been founded years before the marriage, owned through a structure Renata's name had never touched, and that the only thing their lawyer's settlement would actually reach was a house and a savings account Andre had long since let go cold. Over the next 4 days, he documented all of it. The $240,000, withdrawn in slices small enough to slip past a casual eye, traced to an account opened 10 months before the marriage cracked. The shell company her uncle had floated to siphon work and inflate damage claims. The lawyer's name, who Andre's accountant flagged as the same attorney who'd run 2 prior divorces against wealthy local men, both of which involved manufactured asset claims. He built the timeline like a frame, joint by true joint, until the whole shape of it stood square. She'd been planning this for almost 3 years. On the 5th night, he opened a folder on his laptop and named it after the Davenport job, and into it went every record, every screenshot, every photograph. Then he made one call. "Felicia," he said quietly, "it's time. Pull the whole file." Felicia Monroe had been his attorney for 11 years, a compact woman with a flat stare and a habit of letting silence do her arguing. She met him the next morning and laid his documents across her desk and went through them without a flicker. "The holding company can't be touched," she said at last. "It predates the marriage by years, and she's never been an officer, never contributed, never had access. The shell your uncle-in-law set up to pad the claims is, on the other hand, very interesting. That's not aggressive divorce strategy. That's fraud against the court, and there's a paper trail." She set down the page. "Andre, their lawyer is going to walk in there believing he's dividing a construction empire. There's nothing there to divide, but there's plenty there to expose." "I know," he said. "There's more." She passed him a second folder. "This lawyer, Trent Voss. He's done this before. 2 prior cases where he inflated a spouse's hidden assets with falsified valuations and pressured a fast settlement. One of those clients is now under investigation. If we put page 7 of our filing in front of him, the forensic comparison of their claimed assets against the actual trust structure, he's going to realize his entire claim is built on numbers that don't exist, attached to a fraud his own client committed. He'll fold to protect his license." That afternoon, Andre drove out to see his Aunt Carol, his grandmother's daughter, who still lived in the old neighborhood and still kept a garden that fed half the street. She listened on the porch, snapping beans into a bowl, and didn't say a word until he was finished. "Mama never trusted that girl's people," Carol said. "Said they had hungry eyes and idle hands. I told her not everybody's out to get something. She snapped a bean clean in 2. I was wrong and she was right, and I'd give a lot to tell her so." "What do I do, Aunt Carol?" She looked out at her rows of greens for a long moment. "You don't get loud and you don't get low. Loud and low is what they're hoping for, gives them something to point at. You just lay the truth on the table flat and let them sit in it." She set the bowl aside. "A man who built something doesn't have to tear anything down. He just has to show people what's already standing." Andre carried that home like a level in his pocket. He went back to ordinary days. He ate dinner across from Renata and listened to her talk about a girl's weekend that her own calendar said wasn't real. He fixed the loose stair tread that had bothered him for a month, because leaving it broken felt wrong. When she said goodnight, he answered easy and tired, the voice of a man with empty pockets and nothing worth the trouble of taking. She had no idea she was rehearsing for a man who already held the whole script. The settlement meeting was set for a Monday downtown, and Renata arrived in the new bracelet with Trent Voss beside her, smirking before he'd even sat down. He slid his settlement across the table and talked slow and winked at Renata and laid out how generous he was being letting Andre keep his van and his tools. Felicia let him finish. Then she slid a single bound document across the table and said, "Before we discuss your offer, I'd like Mr. Voss to read page 7. Voss kept smirking and flipped to it. The smirk held through the first paragraph. It thinned through the second. By the third, the line-by-line comparison showing that the construction company his client had valued at $9 million was held in a premarital trust she had no claim to, and that the additional assets he'd listed corresponded exactly to a shell company registered to her uncle 10 months before any divorce was discussed. The smirk was gone entirely. He turned the page. Page 8 was the forensic trace of the $240,000. Page 9 was the comparison of the falsified valuations to Voss's 2 prior cases, with the case numbers listed. This filing, Felicia said evenly, has already been entered with the court. The fraud claims are documented. If you proceed on these numbers, you're not negotiating a settlement, you're attaching your name to a fraudulent claim against a man who can prove every dollar of it false. I imagine the bar would find page 9 especially interesting. Voss set the document down very carefully, like it had gotten hot. I need a moment with my client, he said. You don't have one, Renata said, staring at Andre. The company is yours. You let everyone think. I let everyone think I was the help, Andre said quietly. You all decided what that meant. I just let you keep deciding. She tried then, exactly the way Carol said she would. Her voice went soft and her eyes filled, and she said it had been her uncle, that she'd been pressured, that she still loved him, that they could stop all of this if he'd only listen. Felicia opened her mouth, but Andre raised one finger, and she went quiet. 9 years you sat at my table and never once asked what I built, he said. You didn't ask because you'd already decided it was small. That's the part you got wrong. He stood and gathered his jacket. I make my living putting up things that hold weight. I know the difference between what's load-bearing and what just looks heavy. You were never load-bearing, Renata. You just stood in front of the thing that was. He walked out. The room stayed silent behind him. Renata sat at the table beside a lawyer who would not look at her, surrounded by pages that spelled out line by line the precise architecture of everything she'd misjudged. 10 months had passed like water. Andre stood in the doorway of a workshop he'd built from the slab up. On a few acres past the edge of town, the smell of fresh-cut pine, thick in the morning air. Sawdust hung gold in the light coming through the high windows, he'd said himself. The percolator sat on a workbench in the corner, still going strong, and his coffee was hot in his hand. Out past the open door, a long bed of tomatoes he'd staked in spring had gone heavy, the fruit splitting at the seams under its own weight. He'd taken the Davenport job and 3 more like it, and the company had crossed into a scale he used to only imagine at 26 with his single truck. He'd opened a training arm in his grandmother's name that paid young men and women from the South Side to apprentice the trades on real sites with real pay, and the first cohort of 9 had just topped out their first building. He'd hired 2 of them on permanent the week before. Jada came out to the workshop with a thermos, a structural engineer he'd met when she'd caught an error in a load spec, and told him plainly instead of softening it. She asked about people and process, never about his balance sheet. She was steady company, and she leaned in the doorway beside him without needing the silence filled. He heard about Renata the way Carol said he would, sideways from Marcus. Trent Voss had withdrawn from the case the same afternoon and was now answering questions from the bar about his 2 prior divorces. Renata's uncle was facing fraud exposure that had cost him every subcontract he'd ever clawed for. Renata herself had taken an administrative job 2 counties over, the divorce having left her with a house she had to sell, and an empty account she'd already emptied herself. Her own mother had stopped speaking to her over the shame of the uncle's collapse. She'd called the office once, asking to speak to the owner, and hung up when she learned his name. He registered all of it, then he set it down and let it go, because carrying a grudge was just storing weight you'd already been told you didn't have to bear. The sun climbed higher, and he crouched at the end of the tomato bed, pinching off a sucker the way his grandmother had taught him, his thumb learning the plant the same way it had learned 1,000 joints and seams. Jada said something dry, and he laughed, the real kind, and the tomatoes hung red and patient on the vine, ready in their own time the way good things always are. Some things, he thought, you don't have to defend. You just have to build them solid enough that they speak for themselves. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.